Hello, hey, my name is Ed. Okay, this is another response, another vid that's kind of inspired by uh, Ziploc Gory's Female Characters of the Week. I did one for Power Girl, and the other ones I was thinking about was either Storm, who I've liked for a long time, especially throughout the 80s. But I'm going to pick a different one. I'm going to pick Jan Van Dyne, the Wasp. Um, and I wish this was going to be tough because I wish I could come out and say something really, super highfalutin, like, oh yes, the character represents the literary symbolism and archetypes of human dynamism and symbolism or whatever, or I wish I could point to people and just be like, yeah, there was this great series that came out in 1995 and Alan Moore wrote it and Jim Lee drew it and Alex Ross did all the covers and it changed comics forever and the star was Janet Van Dyne. But unfortunately, I don't have any of that. I actually just have a lot of nostalgia for the character. The character was just, in comics. She was in the Avengers and stuff when I first started learning how to, read comics and stuff like that. And she was always around in Marvel Comics, and that's part of why I like the character, I know right now, as I'm recording this, she's sort of dead or in limbo or in Dimension X or something like that. Either way, they're not really using the character. But still, I still have affection for the character. I really liked, back in the day, the way that George Perez drew her and the way that John Romita Jr., or not John Romita Jr., John Buscema drew her, kind of with that sort of 60s glamour girl bob thing going on. The character was kind of drawn to be cute and sexy, but not overly so. One thing I remember reading of something that Stan Lee wrote when he was talking about coming up with the character, where he decided he was going to give Henry Pym Ant-Man a sidekick. He said the original idea was she was going to be this bored, rich socialite who was always hanging around, and she was always trying to get Hank Pym to quit the adventuring lifestyle and things like that. And he said, well, I thought about it. I thought, well, Hank really probably wouldn't be attracted to a girl like that. And he goes, more importantly, I would get bored writing her. So then he kind of decided to make the personality kind of more, bubbly and lighthearted and a real go-getter. And, she loves adventure and things like that. And I think, in those early stories, it made quite an interesting balance of personalities. That was another thing I liked when I was reading the comic books back in the day, back in the late 70s and early 80s, how, she didn't have the most striking, awesome superpowers or whatever, but in a group dynamic, she had an interesting worldview and an interesting, like I said, personality that kind of bounced off the other different people that were in the group, Let's see here. One interesting thing, I think, is, like I said, I'm reading these comics in the 80s and whatever. And yeah, they did that story, of course, where, Hank had a nervous breakdown and he backhanded her and stuff like that. But, in the very next issue, she's like, you know what? I tried to stick with you, through all this, and what you did is you turned around and hurt me and humiliated me. Get the fuck out of my house, or what? She didn't say that, and I probably shouldn't be cursing, but you saw the character kind of, regain her dignity, regain her confidence, stick up for herself, assert herself a little bit more, and become leader of the Avengers. You know what I mean? And and even in some of those other more 70s type stories where she might not have been necessarily saving the day or whatever, but at least she did something kind of interesting, whether it was saying something funny or interesting or adding something to the conversation that was taking place at that time, even if it was like, whatever, Dr. Bad Guy, and maybe she flew around his head and zapped him a couple of times and had bees attack him or whatever. At least she did that. At least she did something. Like I said, I'm reading these stories in like the 80s, but at the same time, I was able to read lots of the reprints of those older issues of the Avengers from the 60s, and some of the original issues too. I think they were reprinting them in a comic called, Well, they had two. It was Marvel Super Action, and it was Marvel Triple Action. But it's kind of interesting, comparing that at that time modern depiction of the character versus the '60s version, where she really didn't do a whole lot. Hank would be like working in the lab or whatever as Goliath or whatever, and he'd be like, "Oh, I'm busy, babe. I'll talk to you later." And she'd go, "Humph," and like walk out of the room, and then he'd be like, "Oh, don't be mad." And he's like, and she'd say something, really kind of, what do I want to say here? Stereotypically female, like, "Oh, I was just mad that you didn't notice my new hairdo," or something like that, And when the action would start, she would either be like completely missing or just taken out like really quickly. Like the bad guys would just trap her in a jar or something. And I remember thinking as a teenager, thinking like, what does this person do? What good is this person? What is your function on this team? And you can even compare that to like Sue Richards at the time, who, depending on which comic it was, at least, got to faint. At least she got to come on the page and do something, and then it would be like, "Oh, the Hulk is too powerful," and she got to faint. At least you got to do that. At least you got some face time that showed something about what was going on in her stories. Or even those older Stan Lee comics, those Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Stan Lee, Don Heck things, where she'd be at, she meaning now the Wasp, would be at like, Wasp size, and it's like, "Oh, I've got to push the lever, but it's too heavy, but I must! At least you got to push the lever, but But in some of those Roy Thomas stories from the '60s, it's just kind of interesting, because she really didn't even function, at best, she was maybe the damsel in distress, you know what I mean? And then looking back, blah, 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 blah. I know it's a different time and all that sort of thing. I'm not trying to say anything about anything, I'm not trying to say Roy Thomas is a misogynist or a chauvinist or anything like that. I get that it was a different time, but it's just interesting to look at it from, a different standpoint. But yeah, she was obviously just there to be the token female, to keep the group from looking too much like a sausage fest, But anyway, let's go back to the present day, One thing I really, 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 really like, I really dig the way they use the character in the Earth's Mightiest Heroes cartoon. I really like that, Jan. I think they kept all the best bits from her past what do I want to say here? From her past depictions, she's still lighthearted, still bubbly, still fun-loving, but they also make her, seem like she's kind of a smart person at the same time. She's not like an airhead or anything like that. And even more importantly, I like the fact that they still make her seem kind of powerful in her superpower form, even when she's at Wasp size. She still has very powerful energy blast and things like that. And I'm not too sure if they, well, I don't know, because the later comic book depictions, I don't think they really touch too much on the fact that she's supposed to be as strong, or if not stronger, in Wasp size than she is in her normal human size. Matter of fact, up until they killed the character off, there's a few things of they had her, growing and things like that. But anyway, like I said, I really like the character. I think the character actually has a lot of potential. I think there's enough with the character's backstory and things, with her being an heiress, with the whole fashion designer thing. She could support her own series. I don't know if the series would sell. It probably wouldn't. It might actually do better as a television show than it would as a comic book. But, she would know people just from being a socialite and things, She would know people in, like, the celebrity world and entertainment world. She would know, like, the Paris Hiltons of the world. But she'd also know, like, all the Bill Gates and the Bernie Madoffs of the world. Wait a minute. Is Bernie Madoff who I want to say? Warren Buffett. That's who I want to say. Warren Buffett. But she might know the Bernie Madoffs, but, hopefully she wouldn't be friends with them. And those type of people. And, there's all types of stories you could spin off of that, Of course, there's the whole Avengers connection, There's the whole Hank Pym connection. But like I said, you could do it in such a way that, these would be stories that worked, specifically for Jan, and you could do, just a real lighthearted superhero type thing, That's pretty much it. That's why I like the character. I hope, you've all enjoyed this. Tell me what you think, and, peace.